On this Dakota Life Virtual, our guest is Hilary Morey, who in real life is an environmental review senior biologist with South Dakota Game Fish and Parks. Hi, Hilary. But today we're going to ask her to step out of that role. She has got some great tips and practical ideas for in the kitchen with your wild game. And like you mentioned to me, Hilary, the key is using that wild game nose to tail.
Yep, that's what we try to do in our household here. We put a lot of time and effort into harvesting these animals, and so we feel like it really means a lot to try and use as many pieces of the animal as we can. Helps reduce waste, and also, really allows us to respect that animal for giving its life to us to be able to use it as food.
Well, Hilary has prepared some things, and today we're going to have get a few tips and tricks and ideas about making stock that you can use in soup and other bases, and also soup, and then canning some wild game meat. We're going to have some tips on canning goose coming up in a little bit. So first off, when you're not preparing a meal, what does an environmental review senior biologist do on our behalf with GF&P?
Yeah, so my role with Game Fish and Parks is to work with developers that come into the state. So say if they want to build a new road or build a new housing development, or even large-scale projects like wind farms, solar farms, I work with those developers to try and help them avoid any impacts to wildlife, particularly threatened and endangered species in our state.
So I suppose you've discovered on ways and some of these projects and things can coexist, but to do it bothly in the goal of the project, but to be as friendly as possible for the wild game that are already in that space.
Yep, that's exactly what we strive for, is to work with developers and try and help everybody coexist.
Both you and your husband, as we've talked, are very active fishing and hunting, so you've really had a lot of practical in-house experience on how to make the most of after those hunting and fishing efforts are back home.
Yeah, definitely. I would say that probably 98% of our protein consumption is all wild game, fish, ducks, geese, deer, pretty much anything. And we've been kind of adventurous this year, especially with the big shutdown. It's just kind of a time to try something new, try things that you've never had before, species you've never had before, dishes that you've never tried. So it's been kind of fun.
Well, walk us through. We're going to concentrate on the turkey here to start off with. And why don't you walk us through a little tips, particularly when you've harvested that turkey and you want to make the most of that carcass and turning it into stock.
Sure. Yeah, so my husband went out and harvested a turkey a couple weeks ago, and so after he took the legs and the breast meat off, I went out and skinned the carcass that you can see here in this picture, and then used that carcass to turn it into turkey stock to use in other dishes, and then also made soup out of it as well. So we prepare that carcass first by cleaning it up a little bit, and then I just basted it with some simple olive oil. You can really use any kind of oil that you'd like, just to get a little bit more flavor. So you oil your carcass with the olive oil and the brush, and then you salt it really well. And after you're finished oiling that carcass, then you put it in the oven at about 400 degrees for, I think it was about 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes total, just until it looked nice and brown.
What's part of the goal of baking that in advance of putting it in the pot to create stock?
And so that roasting process just brings out a little bit more flavor. And you can certainly make stock out of any carcass, either roasted or unroasted, but it's just a little bit more rich flavor. You get that real rich, meaty type of flavor in your broth. And also, you get that salt really helps add a little bit more flavor as well, kind of concentrates in that meat. It's one of the few opportunities you have to flavor that meat before it goes into the pot.
Okay, it's a half hour later, and we've got that turkey out of the oven. What do we do next?
Yep, so you take your turkey carcass and you put it in a very large stock pot. Then you cover that with cold water, and you want to use cold water to start with because that really helps develop the stock better than using warm water. It helps bring out some of the collagen in that stock, and that's one of the things that's supposedly really healthy for you in bone broth or stock. And then I also added a little bit of water to the baking sheet that you can see on the left, and then let that sit for maybe 10 minutes and scraped all those bits up, because that's even more flavor you can add back into the stock.
Well, you know, this next picture is something that really kind of surprised me a little bit. But talk a little bit about, we've got feet.
Yes. So one of my favorite chefs always, he says that you eat on a duck, you eat everything but the quack, and a turkey, you eat everything but the gobble. So we've really taken that to heart in our house. This tip I learned from that chef, Hank Shaw is his name. And so duck feet are another way to add more collagen. You can also use a pig's knuckle or a calf's foot, but you basically take those feet, clean them up a little bit, and then score them with a really sharp knife, just a few slices across the joints there, and then add those into the stock as well, and let them cook with the carcass for 6 to 12 hours.
Okay, and then we've got an array of vegetables, of course, that would go into it. What are some of your favorites to include in a stock?
Well, there's always the go-tos, the carrots, the onion, and the celery. And I really like to use the scraps. So after I'm done cutting up carrots, celery, onion for any other dish, I'll take those scraps like you see on the cutting board there, and I just throw them in a freezer bag. And then when I'm making stock, I'll just throw a handful of carrots, a handful of onions, and some other scraps, sometimes even garlic skins. So then you're really using as much of that produce as you can, instead of just using chopped up onions that you could put in another dish. Some of the other ones you could add in there would be, if you wanted to do something a little different, would be, say, fennel. That's another one. You could also, I've done a couple of different stocks, like with more of an Asian flair, where you just add raw onions, and then things like Chinese 5-spice and star anise. So you can really do a lot with it.
And again, when you get everything in the stock pot, you were talking about several hours that you're going to let that simmer and come together?
Yep. So the turkey stock that I made is kind of a nice opportunity, because I started it in the morning, and you can watch it all day, and I just let it go basically till I think 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So it was about 8 hours total that it was cooking on the stove.
So if that doesn't get the smell in the house, if that make you hungry, we'll do a quick turn here, so you can actually, with what you did in this case, is put together a quick turkey soup.
Yep. Yeah, so we took that turkey breast from the turkey that my husband shot and cleaned. So I let that sit out for about 30 minutes at room temperature to warm up. And again, salted it really well to get some flavor in there. And then I actually poached that turkey breast in the turkey stock that I was going to make soup out of. So you put that turkey breast in the stock for, I believe it was 30 minutes. And then I checked the temperature, made sure it was done, chopped it up, added my vegetables, and then made some dumplings go with it. So I was able to make, that was 2 meals out of the same carcass, same bird.
But at the same time, with a big stock pot like that and cooking that stock, we want to move ahead and take a look at some ways to save that for future dishes. And one of the ways you recommend is pressure canning. So let's walk through some of those steps on taking that stock after you've had your turkey soup and you want to get back to doing some canning with it.
Yeah, so I like to can my stock. It saves a little bit of freezer space because it's shelf stable. So you just need some bare canning essentials. You have your jar lifter on the left there, the lids and the rings, of course, a big canning funnel, and then a lid lifter, which is basically just a magnet on a stick, so you don't have to reach into the hot water to grab your lids out. Then you want to make sure that you wash your jars really well, rinse them out before you start, make sure everything's clean. And then, of course, you'll need a pressure canner for this. You can't use a water bath canner. So the pressure canners are a little bit more labor intensive, but I find that the product is really nice. It's great to be able to have soup or stock just ready to go at the opening of a jar. So after your jars are nice and washed and clean, you put them into the canner with about 2 to 3 inches of water, with some water in the bottom of the jars as well. And then you want to heat those jars up on the stove. And I like to strain my stock. You don't have to do this. It's an extra step, but I'll line a mesh colander with a paper towel, and that just kind of filters out any of the little sediment that's on the bottom. It makes for a prettier looking jar, and it also removes some of those impurities that could maybe affect your flavor if it's sitting on the shelf for a while. So then, after your jars are all warm, you set your stock back on the stove, and you also warm that up, so you want everything to be hot. Then you can ladle your stock into the jars, and you want to leave about 1 inch of headspace, which is basically the bottom band on those jars. So then you fill those jars up, add some lids to the top, and once you're all finished, you put them back into your pressure canner, and then seal it up tight. Vent the steam for 10 minutes, and then you process. My book says 10 pounds of pressure for 25 minutes for those quart jars. I just generally leave mine at about 12 pounds of pressure. If I monkey too much with the heat on my stove, personally, it tends to vary too much. So that's just where it sits, is 12 pounds. But that's just fine as well.
You know, and from the experience we've had in our home with the pressure canner, is you don't need to be intimidated by it, but you alluded to that, regulating the heat to maintain that pressure so it doesn't continue to go up, but then it doesn't get too low either.
Yeah, so it's not too bad once it's on the stove. You just have to pay attention a little bit so you're not creeping up too high, and you definitely don't want to get too low either.
Yeah. Okay, and after that, then we get basically you need to, when you've hit that 25-minute mark, just shut the heat off and let things slowly come back down so you can lift the lid when it's back to zero.
Yes, that is very important. You have to let the pressure vent on its own, and I've had to scold my husband for that once before, and he's learned very quickly not to touch or vent the steam beforehand.
Yeah.
But once it's all finished, you let your jars sit. I usually let them sit for 10, 15 minutes. Sometimes I'll even let it sit for quite a while if I have other things to do, cool off a little bit, and then I set them on the counter, let them cool, and check the seals 24 hours later.
I always appreciate you start to hear that satisfying sound of the thunk when the jars cool down and those lids sit. So
Yep.
You're all set to go, and so those are shelf stable. Any particular time you want to use those in the next 12 months, or you have some options there?
Yeah, generally about a year. I think some of the newer canning lids, they say that you can leave them up to 18 months. Most of our stock doesn't last that long in our house, but you can leave it that long if you prefer.
Do you, before we leave the stock issue and we can some meat, any personal differences outside of wanting to use that harvested animal nose to tail, where that stock from wild game is going to be a little different makeup or flavor than if you go buy chicken stock off the shelf at the store?
I haven't done a side-by-side comparison, but I know for a fact that the stock that we make at home is much less. It has a lot less sodium in it.
Yeah.
I tend to like to salt my food after it's cooked, just because you never know who you're going to be having over for dinner if they have different dietary needs. So I like to leave mine fairly, I guess you can call it bland, as far as the salt goes. But the big one, I think, is the duck stock, because I guess I haven't seen that in stores. Maybe you can buy it, but that one's just kind of a different flavor, and I really like it.
Well, I like to. One more step we want to take here. I like to call this your goose is cooked, because since you've got that pressure canning steps together, consider canning some meat.
Yeah. So we here in Pierre, we're pretty lucky. We have a very long goose season, so we do a lot of goose hunting. So this is relatively simple. You take some goose breasts and chunk them up into about 1-inch pieces. And these, you can can them raw like this, but you get better flavor if you roast it. So I took these chunks, I put them in a 400-degree oven for about 10 to 12 minutes, and kind of stir them around halfway in between. But then you come out and you just want them browned, like in this picture, so they're still raw in the middle. So after they're browned, then you get all of your canning gear together again, the jars, the lids, and everything. And then you can start packing that hot meat again into those hot jars. So this here is a video of how to do that. So take, some scoops of that meat, pack it in those jars, and you can really get quite a bit in these quart jars. So pack that in there, and then I like to add a little bit of just commercial beef stock for a little bit of flavor. You can use plain water as well. So you pack that in there nice and tight, kind of poke a plastic utensil around in there to get any bubbles out, and same steps as the stock. Then you put your lid on top and put them into the pressure canner.
I suppose it depends a little bit on serving size. You probably could use a little smaller pint jar or something, but I mean, that depending on what you're planning for use, that's a good family size, the quart size.
Yeah, I like the quart size just because it is quite a bit of work to can meat in general. And I've done both quart and pints, but we find that my husband and I can get usually 2 meals out of a quart jar versus if we do a pint, then it's 1 meal. So I like to have kind of a mix of both on hand, but tend towards the quart jars.
You made a reference earlier where you get some ideas from Hank Shaw. And why don't you, as we close out, maybe invite people to do a little research and a little experimenting on their own. Where did you run across the Hank Shaw books?
Yeah, so Hank Shaw was, he was actually a speaker at Pheasant Fest that I went to a couple of years ago, and I watched him present, and he kind of, not made fun, but he was, I guess he did. He poked fun at folks that put cream and mushroom soup on everything. And so it's like, oh, I guess I've done that a time or two. But yeah, he had some really, really unique recipes. He's actually a classically trained chef, and he went through and painstakingly researched how to convert some of these really fancy recipes into wild game recipes. And I love all of his books, the Buck Moose, Duck Goose. They're great, and it's cool because he has some hunting stories in there as well, from his experience, and then some really good cooking techniques as well. I like to kind of branch out a little bit too. In the picture before that, there was an Indian cookbook. I like to just try all sorts of new different stuff, and a lot of this wild game lends itself to those types of recipes. Indian food, Mexican food. I've even toyed a little bit with Thai food. That one still working on, but yeah, it's really fun to just try something out of your comfort zone.
Well, we would encourage everyone, thanks for your help, Hilary, and encourage everyone that if you're a hunter, whether it be if you're a deer or antelope or one of the larger species, or if you're an upland game hunter or waterfowl, to try a few different things, or if you're not a hunter, find one who's very prolific and see if they will share. Well, Hilary, thanks for the work that you do with Game Fish and Parks, and particularly with the review and things with development in the state and finding that balance. And thanks for your tips today. We wish you the best for the remainder of your turkey season and the seasons ahead for you and your family.
Yes, thank you. It was great talking with you today.
Take care.
You too.